Welcome to the Fantasy Rugby Draft Podcast, Aviva Premiership Edition. Thanks for downloading and listening. I'm Bruce Wilkinson, and joining me in the booth is our Northern Hemisphere correspondent, Kuchartown. How are you, sir?
Get some. I'm good. I'm glad to be here, and I have a title now too. That's very impressive sounding. Northern Hemisphere correspondent.
Yes. Well, let's get into your article, mate. So I guess let's start from a very macro viewpoint. So Super Rugby versus the Aviva Premiership. What are the big differences that you see that will impact Fantasy Rugby Draft for Aviva?
I think the biggest thing will be the lack of buys, and because I think that has a few different effects in the sense that I think it affects greatly your strategy with fly halves, but we'll sort of come back to that in more sort of detail later, but I think it affects that a great deal. Just in the way you sort of structure your team. It's a very, you know, having backups is a whole different scenario when players are playing every week. So you don't necessarily, you're probably more likely to handcuff players rather than just have players from other teams to switch in. I think also the other very different sort of scenario in Super Rugby, generally the guys who are the international players are guys you want to get on your team because more often than not they're the better players. But in the Aviva Premiership, and this may be sort of new to some of the listeners in the Southern Hemisphere, but during we'll hear what they call the Autumn Internationals, what we would call back home, the end of year tours, while England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, France and Italy are playing, the club game goes on. So within your squad, if you have a lot of English players, for example, at Saracens, you have to have enough depth to cover when they're going to be away for those sort of 4 weeks in November and then again in the Six Nations in February, March. So it's that a player to me greatly affected by that in terms of his rankings will be Owen Farrell, because I would think if he wasn't playing for England, or this was Super Rugby and he wasn't taken out of Super Rugby for international duty, he would probably be one of, if not the very highest ranked players in the game.
20 points per 80 matches. That's in the top 5.
Yeah, that's pretty handy.
Game. That's really good.
So, with him being away on England duty, he loses a lot of value, and also not to get too far into the weeds, but we don't really know who his backup is either at Saracens, which makes things a little bit difficult. I have an inkling that they may actually, because I've seen Saracens do this before, it might have been a couple of years ago, but they actually had Alex Good playing at 10, and kicking goals, I might add, on a couple of occasions. So whether that's going to be the philosophy, I don't know, but it's a possibility because, last year they had Charlie Hodgson, who, he played in the Lions team in New Zealand in 2005. He was never quite nailed it at international level, but he was a handy enough player for England, but he was always a very, very good club player. And okay, he was at the end of his career and, was suffering from a similar sort of, or sporting, shall we say, a similar sort of hairdo to you, Bruce, by the end of his career there. But, not entirely by choice, I suspect. He was still a handy enough player and a handy enough guy when, Owen Farrell's away. It was like, well, Charlie can get out there and we won't be too badly affected.
Yep.
In Super Rugby, I guess you have players that are rested, and obviously you have the buys, but it's not quite the same thing. 'Cause, the buys, the team obviously isn't playing at all, whereas no buys in the Premiership, guys taken out for international, so the team needs to find a capable substitute.
Yeah, and you raised a couple of really interesting points I wanted to jump in on there. So Alex Lozetsky, I assume that's how you pronounce it or get close to it. So he's listed as the fly half at the moment. If you could guarantee that Alex Lozetsky was going to be, or Lozowski was going to be the backup to Owen Farrell, then I think you'd be really happy. And I think we would rank him right up there beside Freddie Burns at number 1. And the reason for that is because you don't have to overdraft Alex Lozetsky either. You could get him fairly cheaply quite late on. I think we have him at the back of the 8th, back of the 9th round even. But there is that little bit of uncertainty, as you've just raised with Alex Good here. Another mantra of drafting is that you can't necessarily win your fantasy rugby draft with your first round pick, but you can certainly screw it up and lose a fantasy rugby draft because of it. So I don't know about you, Cooch, but I'm personally quite risk averse in the first round, and I like to make sure that I at least get something out of my first round pick, and it's not a bit of a swing for the fences.
No, that's not the time to be brave, that's for sure. And this Alex Lazewski character, I mean, we spoke about the Unabomber earlier. He sounds like a relative of the Unabomber. I honestly wouldn't know this guy if he jumped out of my cornflakes in the morning. I'd be surprised, obviously, that someone was hiding in my cornflakes, but that I certainly wouldn't recognise him. So, quite what he brings to the table, I don't know. I saw one game last year when Saracens had a fly half. I'd never heard of the bloke. I assume Farrell was away and Hodgson was injured or something like that, but I assumed it was a young guy, a guy they're bringing up through the ranks. I don't even know if that was the case. It's just an assumption on my behalf, but I can't remember the guy's name, and I don't remember seeing him again, so I don't imagine he's the second coming of Johnny Wilkinson.
Yeah, indeed. And so you mentioned fly halves are going to be quite important. I don't think we would recommend having 2 starting fly halves in your team. I think the reason that we say that is because you're probably going to have to spend a pretty high draft pick to get there. And after you get, well, depending where you are if the top fly halves are gone, and you're probably going to go outside back with your first pick as well, and then flip back and see if you can get another starting fly half in that second or third round. But to use, some of your top 5, top 6 draft picks on 2 fly halves seems a bit rich when you need to start stocking up on a lot of outside backs.
Yeah, I think in looking at the points from last season, it seems compared to the Super Rugby, outside backs were relatively even more valuable than they were. Maybe it's midfield backs were less valuable, chicken or the egg type scenario. But I think when you have, as I sort of discussed in the article, I think the strategy with the fly half is a strategy I think I would look to go with would be to handcuff the guy. Yep. So you basically, again, because there's no buys, every team is going to have a fly half starting every week. And if your number 1 guy, whether that be, I'm assuming Cipriani will be the number 1 at Wasps. So if he's out, the assumption would have to be, I know, assumptions make an ass out of you and me, as they say, but the assumption would have to be that Gopeth is then going to be starting, and he will be obviously goal kicking. Mm-hmm. So that's not a bad thing if you have both on your roster. If all of a sudden, for argument's sake, you have Cipriani and Nick Evans on your roster, if you do, you're going to have a crap team everywhere else. But there's nothing to say that, a week when Cipriani is not playing, that Evans may not be playing either, and then all of a sudden you've gone from having 2 outstanding fly halves to none, and you're going to have to draft another one where, Wasps are always going to be having someone starting.
Yeah, and there's a point to that as well, is that some folks might like that theory in that they can use them as trade bait. They can use that Cipriani and Evans as trade bait, but that is a risky strategy. We've certainly seen in a lot of our leagues that most folks, especially when it comes to those really, really high-end value players that were in the first kind of couple of rounds, they're very hesitant to give those up. There's a lot of, they're just risk averse. They'd much rather stick with someone that they've drafted than trade him away and then see him blow up and wreck your season. So I think it's a risky play if you did try and stockpile and then sell them on to someone else. But just to touch on, we couldn't split Freddie Burns, Nick Evans and Cipriani. Burns had a much higher average points per 80 minutes at 20. Evans was 17 and Cipriani was 15. But with Sippers going up to Wasps, I expect that to go up as well. But the reason we had Freddie Burns where he was is because we feel as though you could, for a couple of reasons really. Leicester, I suspect, are going to go fairly well under Mage this season again. And also because you can get Freddie Burns' backup a lot cheaper than you can get Danny Cipriani's. You're going to have to draft Gopeth quite high because a lot of people are going to know that name and they're going to draft him a lot earlier than they would Nick Evans' backup and Freddie Burns. So Jackson and Williams are ones that you can probably wait on a later round draft pick. And even then, down the line, you can probably pick up someone off the waiver wire and then ask for the second round, the backup to them, because it's invariably not many else. If you don't own the starting player for that handcuff, it's unlikely you're actually going to own the backup either. So That's why we put Burns and Evans at 1 and 2. A good example, and you pulled this out in your article, Cooch, about Gareth Steenson as well, in that he was the top minutes last year, and not surprisingly, he was the top point scorer. But there's a big Henry Slade cloud floating over him, whether or not Slade goes into that 12 or 10 or Devoto's in there or who's kicking. There's just, again, there's enough uncertainty there that we push Gareth Steenson down, and I'll get your take on that in a wee bit when we go through a couple of the fly half situations. But is there anything else from a kind of a macro point of view that you want to pull out between the differences?
I think another thing to perhaps just be aware of is it's a very, very long season, and the 22 rounds in the Aviva Premiership. Correct me if I'm wrong, 17 in Super Rugby, I believe, before you get into the playoffs. So the way the weather works will have a rather large effect. So some of the teams in the Midlands, Leicester's Welford Road is normally a bit of a bog come winter time. The Wreck at Bath is also normally a bit of a bog in the winter time. Traditionally that's suited Leicester because they played a very forward oriented game and just tried to ruck the shorts off everybody, and that was about it. Now they're playing a more expansive game, so we'll see if miraculously their field the pitch at Welford Road is in much better condition now come winter time. But there's only so much you can do when you're in the Midlands and it rains and you don't see much sunshine, and it's there's you can't grow grass, in the Arctic sort of thing. So they are somewhat restricted, but that will clearly restrict the amount of points that are available if teams are bogged down. I think, a team like Quins generally likes to throw the ball around. Saracens have gone from, just hoisting Gary Owens and chasing them in about 5 years to now they like to spread the ball a lot as well, and they actually play on an artificial pitch now, so they can play a pretty fast game. Obviously, doesn't get affected by the weather to the same degree, but there are quite dramatic seasonal changes throughout the year. It goes from sort of sunshine to dead set winter and to coming back into sunshine at the end of it. So possibly something to be aware of.
No, 100%. And it's going to be a slog for those that are playing. They have been playing Super Rugby for the last 3 seasons and are trying to dabble in a little bit of Aviva Premiership as well, fantasy. This is going to be a slog. This is, it's not only just the players' conditions and what they're playing under as well. It's just the lack of players. So there's only 12 teams compared to, Super Rugby's got 18 in it. So just the scarcity of players, you're going to have to be very active around trading, and there are going to be weeks when your starting players that just aren't playing. Those 6 bench spots are going to have to be utilised and have to be managed very, very carefully.
And that to that point, I think it's most acute when you are talking about fly halves, because there's 10 teams in your fantasy league, and only 12 in the actual league. So at least 2 of those teams, the fly halves will be bums, and you don't want to wind up with one of those. So once injuries also come into play, Nick Evans, I know he sort of seems to be, well, he's getting on a bit too, to be fair to Nick, but he was out for quite some time last year with a broken leg or something along those lines, and Ben Boddicker did pretty well as his replacement. I mean, I don't think he was ever going to get snapped in half. He's, with all due respect to Ben, we'll politely say he cuts a slightly different sort of figure to Evans. I've never seen his mother, but I would suggest he's built more like her than like his father Frano, who was sort of more like a whippet.
Indeed.
But he did a very good job in sort of substituting. But an injury. I'm not saying it'll be Evans again this year, but invariably a top guy's going to have an injury, and that's really going to throw the cat amongst the pigeons. If it's then you're stuck with a decision. Well, do I ride the backup for the next however many weeks, or if it goes over a certain time period, you just cut bait and say, well, I'll get rid of him, I'll bring someone else in, and then hopefully I can, when he's coming back from injury, I can be aware and try and pick him up a couple of weeks before he comes back, before anyone else snatches him up off the waiver wire.
Yep, good call. So we've talked about Owen Farrell in his position and who's potentially his backup and the kind of cloudy scene that it is there. How do you see Stenson, Slade and Devoto shaking out? I've heard various reports, and I understand Slade himself has said he prefers to play 12, but I'm not sure if Stenson falls over, if Devoto goes into 10, Slade stays at 12, and who's going to be kicking out of those two, or if they just eventually want to morph Stenson out of the game and put Devoto at 10. Again, I don't know. How do you see that?
Well, yeah, it's a tough one. It's a bit like sort of being asked, well, you can hook up with that Rebel Wilson lass or that Melissa McCarthy, or put a gun in your mouth and just end it all. It's, well, the gun's looking pretty good, I think last year the implication was that Slade was going to be worked in as the 10 long term.
Okay.
He then got injured, and I think he had a broken leg as well, but it was a long-term injury, whatever it was. And so Stenson sort of became the option. Now, Devoto's been brought in. My understanding was that he would be sort of playing centre, so I would assume there's a couple of options, but I would think there may be a bit of a job share between Stenson and Slade at 10. Mm-hmm. And okay. Because they have a couple of fairly solid guys, Dolman, who's who can belt it up and that sort of thing and can play 12, and then you've got a guy like Devoto who a little bit more will-o'-the-wisp sort of skillful type player.
Dolman jumps out back every now and again at fullback too, doesn't he?
He's I think, am I correct in saying he was in the Saracens squad or something like that? I mean, I think he's handy enough guy. I don't think he'd ever be sort of regarded as a brilliant player, and I don't mean brilliant as in his level. I mean brilliant. He can do sort of crazy things or anything like that. But hey, you need players like that, and he's certainly handy enough. So I don't think that he's just going to be cast casually aside, and there's going to be a Stenson, Slade, Devoto sort of axis there. I think maybe another consideration would be, would those three guys sort of be big enough between the three of them, and particularly to get back to an earlier point. I think in the business they call this a callback, do they not? In the podcasting industry, when the fields are heavy and slow and it's wet, and you've got Northampton's just thumping Luther Burrell up at you, and you've got sort of three lightweight inside and midfield backs, it can become a bit of an issue. So maybe it will be, as the seasons change, they'll bring in some more heavyweight lineup, but time will tell. I think there's enough doubt there that I would sort of steer clear. And that's just
there's doubt.
Easiest option.
There's doubt, and Slade's a name, right? So Slade is going to be someone that someone in your league is going to pull a trigger on. And I saw overreaction theatre the other day with Slade going number 1 overall in a draft.
Ambitious.
Yep, it's ambitious. Now, I get that. A lot of people, and this is kind of a inherent thing in fantasy as well, you want to be that person who says that I told you that Slade was going to be good this season. I think you can do that in round 3 or round 4.
Yeah.
I don't think you need to be 1 overall picking Slade.
It's like one of those things when you're at the pub and someone, you sort of make this outrageous sort of prediction. And then if it comes off, you can remind everyone about it, that you sort of said, well, at the start of the season, well, I told you that guy was going to be awesome, and no one believed me, sort of thing. And if he's not, everyone just sort of forgets about it, and you just sort of fade off, and all's forgiven. And then next year you come out with something equally sort of crazy. So I don't think you want to do that in fantasy though, because you have to live with the mistake the whole year. And I like Slade. I think he's a good player.
Yep.
I'm not sure he's he's quite going to be the guy to absolutely dominate just yet. I mean, he had a pretty bad injury last year, so he's had a decent preseason and stuff. But he's effectively, if you take out most of last season, and he got back a little bit towards the end, and then now coming into this season, he hasn't played an awful lot of rugby, which for a player like him, who's a touch sort of a player, a skillful sort of player, he's not a big lump by any stretch of the imagination. Sure. I think he needs probably a bit of time in the saddle.
Yep, agreed. Okay, let's move on. Let's look at some backlines in general, because that's usually where a lot of the points are scored. So for folks tuning in for the first time, let's have a little bit of a pot at who might be a starting backline. If you've got a starter for 10 for... Not actually a starter for 10, if you've got a backline for the Tigers, so Leicester.
I would assume they would go, well, Young's at 9. I would guess Burns at 10. Midfield, given the sort of state of recruitment, I would say that by bringing in Tamua, I suspect that means that Manu is going to move out to 13. When he played at the end of last season, he was at 12, and Beetham, formerly of the Waratahs, was at 13. So I'm assuming Tamua's been brought in to start. It's, that seems an obvious statement as the day is long. So, and they're certainly going to play Manu whenever they can. And so I would assume that Beetham gets either bumped out to the wing or sits on the bench. I would guess he's the way he played last year. He's in a fairly reasonable shout of getting a lot of starting time on the wing.
Yeah. Okay. So Beetham on the wing. They bought JP Peterson as well. He's on another wing. Is that how you would see it, or?
You say it like that, maybe Beetham goes to fullback and they have...
Well, that's what I was wondering. I haven't seen him play 15, but I ain't seen him play 13 either, to be honest. So maybe there's an opportunity there for him. Don't know.
Yeah, you would expect...
Tate's there, right? Tate was there last year.
Tate was there last year. I think he has left now. I think he was leaving at the end of last season. Someone will correct me very quickly if that's not the case, but that was what I thought was happening. And he was was captain for a while and stuff as well. So, I think Vayanu's certainly going to be on one of the ones.
That's the question, right? He's like a number 4 or number 5 ranked player.
Yeah, he was. Last year they had Gonover as well, but he's moved on. But both of them were fairly dangerous.
Didn't you catch that off Rebel Wilson?
It was Melissa McCarthy. Thank you very much.
Oh, right, pardon me.
And she was, she'd had her hair done, and she was looking quite the picture.
We'll let you know when to send flowers.
Yeah, please do. So I think that will be the way it shakes out. Either way, the Leicester back line is going to be looking pretty dangerous, I dare say. Manu back this year, I think, is going to be sort of devastating. I grew up in the 80s, so I always have an affinity for a man with a rat's tail and wearing really short shorts. But he's a force of nature, and looking at the averages last year on a per 80-minute average, I think he was about 5 points clear of the next midfielder or something like that.
He was head above, absolutely.
Yeah, he will be, even though he is invariably going to spend some time away with England, and if his usual behaviour is anything to go by, maybe just some time away.
Sure.
But either way, I think he's worth a bet.
He is. He's one of those players that you need to own for the how many game weeks you're going to get. He's going to be a difference maker and potentially even win your matchup. He just gives you that. It literally was about 6-point difference to the next player, who was Dolman as well. I think it might have been Dolman or Daly. I can't remember who it was. Christian Daly. Right, which leads me into the Wasps backline. They haven't spent much money in the off season.
No, times are tough in Coventry. So I would, at halfback or scrum half, depending on which side of the equator you're on, Simpson or Robson, I don't think it really matters. They're both pretty useful, and they're both sort of very live wire sort of players.
How do they play with each other? So, for instance, I want to kind of bring the Southern Hemisphere in. So the Chiefs have got Kurbalo and Weber, and any kind of given week, it's actually a good play to play either of them because they pick up decent points. Is that similar to these guys, or do you really need to get the starter?
I would think both would score pretty heavily because they're both, up until recent times, Simpson's been as good a running scrum half as any in the Premiership, and he's not just one of those guys who is nippy. I'd say he's got sort of maybe not long-term speed, but mid-distance speed. He can run away from people and stuff as well.
Yep.
He looks sort of like a bit of a miniature Jason Statham. He's got the sort of shaved head and a bit of a scruffy beard about him and all that sort of thing.
That's been levelled at myself actually once or twice.
Yeah, it's. I don't like it when people take the piss out of you, Bruce. But you know, oh, you thought that was serious? Yeah.
No, they just saw me. They saw my ability on the back of a transporter.
Yeah, well, yeah. You always want to. Travelling with you, you want to make sure you know what's in the boot. No, I will certainly say that. But, I mean, the Wasps. Look, I have all number of anything that happens in English rugby that goes wrong. My immediate sort of default is that it's some sort of Wasps conspiracy theory. So, I mean, the fact that they're buying up all these players doesn't surprise me. Curtly Beale, I think they still said he's 3 or 4 months out.
Yeah, I heard November.
Much better than the original estimate, but.
Yep.
I mean, I think it's going to be a bit of a game of chicken in a lot of leagues to sort of see who wants to or who breaks first to sort of pick him up off a waiver wire. An injury like that, I don't imagine he's going to come back and sort of be all guns blazing. And when he comes back in sort of November, the assumption is they want him to play in the midfield. They certainly don't need him at 10. They certainly don't need him at fullback now they've got LaRue. I mean, you could argue they don't really need him in the midfield either. But in the Premiership in November, when things are getting pretty wet and cold, he's never been renowned as the greatest defender. So whether he sort of gets a starting gig, but I suppose Kyle Eastman's not renowned as the greatest defender either. So it could be interesting, but with him and also Elliot Daly at outside centre, either way, it's not a particularly hefty midfield. It's not certainly not a Melissa McCarthy and Rebel Wilson sort of hefty lineup out there, but probably a little bit quicker.
Sure. Just to go back to your halfback, because I just did some analysis, having a look at last season's stats. Just looking at Dan Robson versus Simpson, and Robson was 14 points, and he actually was the top halfback, 14 points per 80 minutes, and Simpson was quite down the list at about 5 or 6. So there's quite a big chasm between the two. So if
that surprises me.
Yeah, a little bit, right? So just if you are tossing up between the two, and this is a decider factor, then last season was the quite a big difference towards Dan Robson. But just as a general point of view, though. Something that bounced out of me when we were doing all of these stats, we sat around the table, is how many points that halfbacks don't score. It's very, very scarce. And just to be aware that if you're coming up from the Southern Hemisphere doing the Super Rugby comp, just to be aware that halfbacks don't necessarily score as well as they do in the Aviva. So who's going to be playing outside Daly?
Certainly on one wing I would expect to be Christian Wade. They've also got Frank Halai, who not completely.
Is that his name? I thought it was Frank the Tank.
Well, it might as well be. It certainly should be Frank the Gazelle, or Frank the Hot Stepper, because he's fairly lumbering these days. Is Frank? I'm assuming Wade on another wing, and they have a couple of reasonable options at fullback now as well. I don't know which one they go for, to be perfectly honest. I mean, Willie LaRue, he's a big name, but he hasn't been quite the same player in the last couple of years. So I would think maybe Miller is the option, but by the same token,
Miller's a good player, right? So
he is, and I can't imagine you spend the money on Willie LaRue to have him not play. So
yeah, I think they'll go Willie LaRue as well, but it seems an odd place to be putting money down, right? When you've got someone like Rob Miller there and someone when you've got Beale. You've just bought Eastman. Beale can switch and hold if he needs to.
Yeah, it does seem odd to me. I wonder if anything, I haven't seen Miller play wing, but I'm guessing, a lot of fullbacks can fill in there if need be, whether he switches across to Frank Halai's wing.
Sure.
I don't know. It's certainly an embarrassment of riches, that's for sure.
Now, I'm not sure Willie LaRue's going to be coming back straight in. I don't know when he actually turns up at Wasps, so something to check on. I will ask in the next pod. And I'm not sure if you know the answer to that, do you?
I do not, no.
Okay, cool. We'll ask one of the chaps in the next pod, or we'll actually do a bit of research between now and then. Yeah, okay, so that's pretty solid Wasps backline. What about the Saracens backline?
Good players all over the shop, and the thing with Saracens are a little bit like the New England Patriots, and by that I don't mean sort of despicable and unlikable, although that's in my view certainly the case. They tend to plug guys in, and they can sort of make it work. And somewhat unheralded guys, Duncan Taylor, the Scottish sort of midfielder, last year he'd sort of been around for a few years and then been handy enough, and then last year every time he sort of played for Saracens he went really well. By the end of the season was, generally speaking, starting ahead of Marcelo Bosch, the Argentinian centre. So they just tend to plug and play a few of these guys, and it's a good problem to have if you're a Saracens supporter. The bad thing if you're a Saracens supporter is you're going to hell, but we'll move on from that. But they have, because they have options, you're never quite sure who's going to be starting week to week. If you look at the three wingers they've got now, they've got Ashton, they've got Chris Ashton, that is Chris Wiles, who's a US Eagle, but he's a very handy player, and now Sean Maitland coming in as well. So, formerly of the Crusaders and Glasgow, and then more recently London Irish. And he, we used to see in the Crusaders, in a good team, he could be quite dynamic. Now, last year, London Irish were terrible, so they weren't on TV an awful lot. When I did see them, Maitland looked scarcely interested, sort of thing. I mean, it reminded me in classics, classical studies in seventh form. That's how interested he looked. He and was pretty poor, and it wasn't a great team. Now he's going to have a good team around him. They're going to be competing in the Premiership, and probably going to be competing fairly well in Europe as well, given that they're the defending champions. So I expect he will have a bit of a rebound season, but is he going to be starting week to week? I guess another thing of options is they could put him at fullback if when Farrell's away and Alex Good's not in the England match day squad. If he plays 10, then they could drop Maitland back to fullback. But then of course Maitland may well be playing for Scotland as well. So
yeah, that's right. That's what I was going to say as well. So how much time do you think Alex Good is going to be away for England? How likely is he going to be away? Not necessarily starting. I think they seem like they're fairly set with Mike Brown there, or they're fairly happy with him there. But
yeah, it's
obviously in the 22, or at least in the 23, and the larger squad.
Yeah, he's certainly in the larger squad, but on match day he doesn't seem to be. This is totally off the top of my head, but I think he was only on the bench. I think of maybe one Six Nations game last year.
Right. So he's in the suit.
So yeah. So and if that's the case, he might be released back to his club, but because they make those, as long as they make those decisions fairly early on in the week. So, sure. But it's still a risk, isn't it? And if you are risk averse, but the problem with Alex Good is that I was going to say something insulting just because he plays the Saracens and I don't like him. But he's just I'm starting to feel a theme, Cooch. I'm starting to get a sense. Yeah. I'm not the smartest man around, but I'm picking up, my spidey senses are picking up something. I can't quite place it. Yeah, it's well, let me just say this. I went out and watched Saracens when they were playing out in Watford years ago, and Tane Randall was playing for them, and Glenn Jackson was playing for them, and there was about 25 people in the crowd, and about 15 of those are family members of players, and they didn't even look like they wanted to be there. It was a freezing cold day, and now all of a sudden at Saracens are good. They've got fans, packed from the rafters and all this sort of thing. So that's all you need to know about Saracens fans, I think. But sure. I mean, anyway, everyone wants to support a winning team, and it's a very well-run organisation, and they've, since Nigel Ray's taken over, they've taken them from, say middle of the pack generously, and now they're, I would think most people would say that probably the best run sort of club in England. If maybe Wasps, I say you can make an argument for as well. Sure. But his versatility may sort of count against him to some degree. So he was actually the second top points average. And he was player of the year in the Premiership last year as well. And a lot of people were saying that he should should be the starting 15 for England. But I think unless Mike Brown has a drastic, sort of loss of form, to sort of, the degree he's lost most of his hair as well. I suppose it's shaven off anyway. But
and do you think that's why he's such a calm and retiring man?
He's a very pleasant fellow, I think, a fine English gent. And,
sure.
He's a guy who plays for Quins, and even I'm not a huge fan of him as a player. The whole attitude thing sort of rubs me a little bit the wrong way. But I think he's a player that Eddie Jones sort of likes, because Eddie Jones, it's kind of funny now. He's all talking about, you've got to have a forward pack that eats red meat and shits nails sort of thing, and all this sort of carry on. But when he was the Australian coach, the book on the Australian team was just get stuck into their forwards, beat them up, and they don't want to know sort of thing. So he's obviously had a coming to Jesus moment. And now he wants all these hard nuts in the team, and
yep.
Brown is certainly a very competitive and aggressive guy, and sets a bit of a tone. And when you've got your fullback sort of squaring up to the loose forwards and second rows and stuff in the opposition, if it's me playing, I look at that guy and I think, well, he's an idiot. And if that guy starts lumping 7 shades of the proverbial out of him, I'm just going to stand out here in the back line and pretend I haven't seen what's going on. But some people that inspires, they
sure.
Look at it with the little guys in there. I mean, in this day and age, it's posturing anyway, because
yeah, that's right. No one throws anything.
They're going to be suspended for 6 weeks, sort of thing. And,
yep, that's right.
Probably sent down to solitary as well. Yep. So, but
it's it's like Twitter, right? It's emboldening cowards everywhere.
It has indeed.
Empowering them.
It has indeed. There's a lot of sort of keyboard assassins out there who just ready to take you down with a witty phrase and and a bit of nastiness. But I suspect if someone turned up at their door and asked their parents to show them down to the basement where these losers are sitting, they wouldn't be quite so tough.
Indeed. Speaking of losers and basements, front row theories. So this year in Super Rugby, one of the more popular kind of theories that Mossman and I were running with was starting the front row that was playing against the Sunwolves. And that was fairly easy to do because there were 18 teams and you could chop and change. And we're not talking about the stud front rows that are taken by anyone, but getting those bottom kind of tier, that middle tier type players, teams that are playing against, say, the Sunwolves. Is there anything akin to that in Aviva, bearing in mind only 12 teams?
Yeah, I can't think of a front row who's, sort of really, really poor. I don't think to the extent, like to a Sunwolves sort of extent. I don't think there's one whereby they're just going to get properly stuffed, and the team you pick against them by comparison is obviously going to do relatively well. I don't know that there's anyone that sort of weak.
Okay. Who are your top front rows?
To me, I would say not too dissimilar from our backlines really, and this is going to be shaping up for a long season for some of us. But I think Leicester. Harry Thacker they had last year was he may have been around the Tigers scene for a few years, but it was certainly the first I'd seen of him, and he was really quite a dynamic player, real pocket battleship. And even Tom Youngs was out for certainly most of last season, if not all. He's a fairly mobile player as well, and he's very good over the ball. He's a bit bigger than Thacker, but he's sort of a very square, sort of a shaped guy. He's got bloody lats on him, like you wouldn't believe. So, when he gets over the ball, he's fairly good at turning ball over. And, if you're getting those extra points out of your front rowers, you're doing pretty well. The other one, I would think would be, and just to the other point, Leicester, they're going to hold up a scrum okay. So the last thing you want from a front row is having them concede penalties in the scrum. Leicester should not be a problem. And the other one I think is probably Saracens, because they again have, Schalk Brits, who is, I remember him being a middling sort of a player in Super Rugby, but he's been an absolute superstar ever since he's been in the Northern Hemisphere. And, I mean, he sort of, I think would rival Dane Coles for running metres sort of thing. I mean, he's been absolutely spectacular. He obviously he has been called into the South African squad a few times on end of year tours, but he effectively doesn't really play international, so that's not a problem. And even if he's not playing, they've got Jamie George, who again, sort of from the Adrian Strauss sort of school of hooker,
that Willy Wonka Charlie Factory kind of.
Yeah, he's sort of body by Jake, sort of. That's a different sort of a model. Body by Adrian is not sort of, look. You don't want to break it out on the beach quite so much. Handy enough on a rugby field, but So he probably Jamie, though, I think it shows character, because when he was coming up through the grades and they started introducing the skin-tight shirts, he had to know that every game of rugby was going to be a slightly humiliating experience for him, but he's still out there doing it, and he belies his girth, and he's quite skillful. He's got a bit like a Steve Thompson, I guess. He was a guy who didn't necessarily look like much of an athlete, if you could stand to look at him at all.
Yeah,
he was not a good looking.
I've seen some flashes of brilliance with George. Looks good at times.
Yeah, and it's the same. I mean,
got a bit of tickers.
He does, and he's sort of one of those when he gets going in full speed. He has really small steps. He's not a long strider. It can be quite amusing too. Everyone loves to see a fat guy running with the ball.
They do.
The other guy's Marco Vunipola. So I thought he was possibly England's outstanding player in the Australian series. Oftentimes I would see what I thought was Billy Vunipola getting a turnover or making a key tackle, and it stands up and it's actually Marco. So he apparently he's lost weight recently. I mean, none of it's come off his earlobes. That man has the biggest earlobes I've ever seen in my entire life. It looks like he's got a bull's scrotum hanging from the bottom of each of his ears. They're that big. I mean, check it out sometime. It's really something to behold. But he very mobile, very skillful player, turns ball over, can offload, and very good runner. And, I mean, hey, as far as I'm concerned, the front rows just bend over and lean and sweat on each other and that sort of thing. But he's, by all accounts, gotten a lot better at leaning on other fat blokes and sweating in years, so that's not going to be a problem either.
All right, conscious of time, I'm going to nail you down on this one. Who is your number one overall pick? And give us a short reason why. I don't know this actually, so I'm curious.
We talked about not going with your bias earlier, and I'm going to ignore that.
Ding ding, Nick Evans.
Yeah, I am. Not only does he play for Quins, he's a Kiwi bloke, and I just think Freddie Burns, good player. I think he would be a fine option anyway. I mean, I wouldn't have any issue with that. Evans, I think traditionally has been a better goal kicker. His goal kicking wasn't maybe as good last year on a smaller sample size, but people in New Zealand might be a bit surprised because goal kicking wasn't a great strength of his, percentage wise when he was in New Zealand, but since he's been in England, I think it's that sort of sitting there in the facsimile of masturbation he sort of does before he takes a goal kick. Obviously there's a secret sauce he's got going on there because he's really a top-notch goal kicker. And also I think you probably if we go with him and Jackson, I think Jackson probably a slightly better backup than Owen Williams. Perhaps not an awful lot in it. I mean, when I've seen Williams, I've actually been quite impressed about him, and I asked sort of a mate from our rugby club, Hampstead Rugby Club, quick shout out there, and why he wasn't sort of in the picture for Wales, and he said, no, he's just very inconsistent, and that he's a handy enough club guy, but a long way from international, and he, they've got Reece Patchell and stuff from coming through anyway, but and that can sort of, his inconsistency can also materialise in his goal kicking, and he can be a bit scattershot. So that's Nick Evans would be my number one. With Wasps, the Wasps here, Cipriani, I guess. I just have Cipriani's. I mean, he finally made it back in the England team, and he gets busted drink driving the day after. I mean, that's just the sort of tale of his career. He's not a smart bloke, and he just does dumb things, and that's not the guy you want to have as your number one draft pick. And you can take that from a guy who drafted Michael Vick number 1 in an NFL draft a couple of years ago. So I know all about drafting dopes at number 1. It doesn't work out well.
It's a good point you make though with Nick Evans, because in that situation where you are splitting hairs between Freddie Burns and Nick Evans, it is nice to have a little bit of someone you support. If you really come down to it, and maybe your reasoning was 50% he's got a better backup and 50% it's Quinn's, that's a way that you just want to weigh in as well. You get a little bit more pleasure because it's your team, right? It is your own team. You want to be happy with your team. You don't want to be too much of an emotional hedge all the time.
It's also it's a frightening sight when you get a close up in HDTV of Freddie Burns taking a kick at goal, because by Lord, I don't know I don't know where he grew up, but they clearly didn't have Clearasil back in those days, because it's but I say that, I bet he doesn't struggle with the ladies, so he gets all that stuff.
Indeed. Let's have a quick chat about the Singers Sevens. I don't know if you saw any of them yesterday, but there's a couple of players there that I wanted to kind of talk about. I guess the obvious one was Wade. He looked pretty damn impressive. And with the arrival of Willie LaRue as well. I mean, he was always going to look good in the sevens, but in this kind of format. But now that we've got Willie LaRue, Beale coming back a little bit earlier, the players at the fort, Kyle Eastman, I think, we'd still have him ranked, I think, around about the 4th outside back. But I'm looking at that now, and the players like Beetham that we talked about that should go well, but it's still a little bit unclear about what he do. And we had Rokundunguni as well, and Viano up there. So I'd probably, and Heem actually is another player. I'd be considering putting Wade ahead of Beetham at number 8 there overall, and possibly as the third. Maybe even the third, a bit ahead of Rokundunguni as well. Yeah, he looked pretty good.
Yeah, he looks bigger, but he looks ripped as well, which is a nice combo. It's funny because I actually go the other way. I go scrawnier but somehow fatter. That's how I roll. But he does look dangerous, and he's sort of in a point in his career, Wade, I think, whereby he needs to kind of make his move, because he's sort of been around a little while, and he went on the Lions tour as a backup. I think he was called in as a replacement, but still, he hasn't quite made his mark for England. I think now the England wingers, they seem pretty happy with what they've got, but there may be an opportunity sort of floating around to sort of get in there, and once you're in the squad, you're only sort of an injury or whatever away from a great performance, and then maybe you're the man. But I think he kind of needs to make his move maybe this year, or he risks sort of falling out the back door and being replaced by the next generation of guys coming through. So he should certainly be motivated, and judging by what he was doing at the Sevens, I only saw highlights, so clearly he's going to look good in highlights. He does indeed look like he is pretty motivated, so maybe that is a good shout. But I think Bryce Heem is another good one as well, because he's a big guy, Heem. He does, and he's sort of one of those sort of Corey Jane-like, I guess, in that he does most things pretty well, and he makes good decisions, and he's got a good fend, and he can offload and that sort of thing. Not going to blow anyone away with outright pace or power or anything, but he's got sort of a little bit of everything.
I'm worried about. So those are wondering. We're talking about the rankings. Where are they on the site, and how can I look at them? We're going to have those up in the next few days. As I say, the same thing with Kuchartown's article here. We'll have that up in the next few days. But yeah, Mossman's working furiously to get those in, so we can. At least you guys can have a quick frame. But if you did want to have a look, you've got an offline draft. You can export the spreadsheet or the commissioner can. It has the rankings in there, and also the rankings are in the live online draft when you go in there. If you just want to fly by the seat of your pants, which we certainly don't recommend. But I'm a little bit worried about Rokundunguni, moreover, from a Bath point of view. What was it? Tabai Matson and things only just turned up. Blackadder's just turned up. Players leaving. It just seems a little bit unsettled there. I'm not 100% sure that I'm all that safe going, all that confident going with Rokundunguni now at 5. I'd probably push him right down below Christian Wade at about 13 or 14.
Yeah, interesting one in that I think he's probably a guy that's fallen out the back door of England, selection and stuff as well, so he should be mostly available. One thing I would say in mitigation for Rocknaguni, and kudos on the pronouncing of the name. I felt actually sure that one's going to trip you up, but he, Bath were a disaster last year, and he still scored fairly well in FRD, in an offensive rugby draft sense. I expect Bath will be less of a mess this year. I think, hopefully, Blackadder and that they are coming in late, but it's a reasonably, he's a reasonably sort of conservative sort of guy, and I think one of his strengths as a coach is probably, the sort of squad working together and togetherness and harmony and all that sort of stuff. So I wouldn't completely give up on him, but from what I saw of Wade, I would certainly say he's probably worth a look over Rocknaguni.
So there's one player that kind of stuck out that we don't have ranked at all, and I'm not even sure if that's the right decision. Well, it's the wrong decision because we should have him ranked. But how much playing time do you think Odogwa, the winger at Sale, is going to get? Paolo Odogwa, because he looked pretty exceptional yesterday. Come across from Leicester, I believe.
Yeah, I didn't see a lot of him last year. So it's sort of, I confess I'm not a huge fan of sevens and stuff, so I'm always sort of skeptical when you see guys coming out of sevens as to whether they're going to be, outstanding players. But wing normally is a position that, guys can do quite well. So, Sale, I think, have had a fair bit of consistency. I think the coach, isn't it, Steve Diamond is the guy up there who's a fairly straightforward and honest sort of a character, and I don't know if they've built their own stadium. I think it's AJ Bell Stadium or something like that, but they'll certainly move to it if it's not their own, and they seem to be doing, as a club, they seem to be doing a lot better. So I would suggest it's probably certainly a fairly good environment for him to be in. I was a bit surprised actually when Cipriani said he was leaving last year. It's intimated that I didn't think he was the sharpest tool in the shed, so maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, because it just seemed a good environment for Cipriani to be in, back, I suppose Wasps aren't in London anymore, so he's only going from Sale to Coventry. It's not exactly, you're not exactly moving from Monaco to Las Vegas sort of thing. Maybe the Wasps environment maybe now is a good settled one as well. But I thought he'd done well up at Sale, and that sort of intimated to me that the Sale environment is a good sound one, and new players coming in can probably do fairly well.
So outside backs for Sale that we have that he'd have to get ahead of is Mike Haley, Will Addison, and the new guy, the leaguey, Josh Tarley, coming in. So I'm not 100% sure those guys are all wingers and fullbacks that he has to get ahead of, but certainly Charnley will probably go on the wing, right?
I would expect so. I mean, it's one of those you don't. Normally when you bring a leaguey in, you have to pay money for him, and if you're going to do that, you're certainly going to give them every chance to succeed. I know Mossman. He always he's funny because he was correct in most instances this year in Super Rugby. I was quite gung-ho on the Jaguares players, and a lot of new guys coming in. I said, well, these guys have done it international level. A lot of them have done it in Europe. This will be just a transition. But his mantra is always, I want to see the guy do it. I haven't seen any evidence of it yet in Super Rugby, so I want to see it. And more often than not with those sort of players, he was right. But he was always quite big on the leagueies, and that's where his theory's fallen down a little bit. Because Reece Robinson's really the only one, and he was only an average sort of player anyway. So I'd be interested to hear his thoughts on the leagueies coming across, because, as I say, he always seems to be a fan. But by the same token, I imagine he, like most people, he doesn't watch Super League over here. Sure. I couldn't even tell you. I assume Wigan are still in it. Hull,
heard of them.
Apart from that, I know there used to be the London Broncos were actually bought by Harlequins Rugby Club, and they were a Harlequins Rugby League, and they were around for a few years. So they don't exist anymore. So I couldn't even tell you half of the teams that are still in the competition. I'm sure Leeds and St Helens maybe.
Yeah, sure. All right, let's move on. Singer Sevens was good though. It's good. It's a good introduction to see some of these young guys. Sam Simmons played well as well. Not sure if he's going to get a starting berth or at least get an opportunity to play at Exeter, but he looked pretty sharp. Just Actually, before I kind of wrap this up, Cooch, is there anything overall that you just wanted to pull out and tease our listeners with, or kind of regale them with?
Well, one of these, this is a callback to one of my bigger theories, one of my few successful theories, you could say, in Super Rugby drafting, is that, you try and shoehorn as many goal kickers into your team as you possibly can. And one year it worked for me very well. Another year, there weren't a great many goal kickers outside of the fly half position, where you obviously, if you have a fly half, they simply have to be a goal kicker, otherwise you're in all sorts of trouble.
But I also think a lot of people had caught on that theory as well, and were rostering these guys, so you didn't quite have the pick of the players that you previously did.
It did seem in a few drafts like I would be one guy, next to pick, and someone would have my eye on Curly Beale, who, might only kick a couple of goals a season, but it always helps, or something like that, and then someone else would snatch him away from me. It felt a bit personal, I won't lie. But to that end, I think one guy, and this goes against what I say about not picking guys that are playing internationals, because this guy certainly will be. He's the Scottish captain, and that's Greg Laidlaw, the scrum half, and he plays at Gloucester. And Gloucester were pretty terrible last year, but he, as a goal kicker, I seem to recall, I think James Hook takes a lot of the longer ones, but Greg Laidlaw's pretty accurate from in close, and he is you only have to pick up as a scrum half. He's not going to blow you away with running meters by any stretch of the imagination. He looks, he and I could run a 100-meter race, and if it was on TV, they'd have to cut to commercial halfway through, and then come back, and we'd still be, we still wouldn't be finished. But he is a guy who is a very accurate goal kicker from a reasonable distance. So if he picks up, kicks 2 or 3 penalties in the game and a couple of conversions, well, there's 10, 12 points. And if he gets a turnover or a try assist or a try, something like that, it's going to go a long way. And those are sort of the difference makers at different positions that can make a difference. In Super Rugby this year, I think, I haven't studied the figures, but anecdotally at least, I would say Artie Sevilla would be a big one of those, whereby he just scored so much more heavily than your average loose forward. He was such an advantage week to week, and I think Greg Laidlaw could be one of those guys as well. As I say in the article, I do say that he's not going to get a lot of running meters and defenders beaten and all that sort of thing, but if he can pick up a few points every now and again and then kick the goals, he'll be a pretty handy guy to have.
So he kicked 22 penalties last season and 12 conversions. So yeah, to your point, doesn't have to pick up all of them or even a massive amount, so he's not kind of hinging on the success of Gloucester to be any good. So as I mentioned before, Dan Robson was 14.1 points per 80 minutes, sorry. And Laidlaw was 2 at 12.2. I was expecting that number to be a little bit bigger, but still, it's consideration to say, that would probably push him over the edge, especially if you're considering that kind of Wasps halfback position, scrum half position, is a bit of a timeshare.
And if you like your players cheerful, then Greg Laidlaw is certainly for you. He just seems to be having the time of his life out there on the pitch.
Speaking of cheerful, number 3 though, right? Frank Hogward, someone that's not in South Africa anymore.
Yeah, you would think that now that Oscar Pistorius is behind bars, he might feel safe to go back. But
that's right. Yeah.
He's a guy I've had in my team in Super Rugby a few times. He's a legit running halfback. Not only can he make breaks, he's got the pace to run away from people, and he may get a little bit of time. I didn't see a great many Worcester games last year, but certainly in Super Rugby he would, for the Bulls, he would get the odd bit of game time on the wing, and he can really rack up some points there. Or alternatively, when they would, most teams sub their halfback, with the possible exception of the Highlanders, I suppose, in close games at least, he would, instead of being subbed off, he would be subbed onto the wing. So, it's a good way to sort of shoehorn an extra few points into a shift.
Absolutely.
With Francois.
Yep. Okay. No, I'm conscious of time. We've gone over, but this has been a fantastic start to the Aviva Premiership analysis. Looking at some really good Some really good options there, Cooch. So really appreciate it. A little bit of admin. You can follow us on Twitter, Fantasy Rug Draft, Fantasy RUG Draft, or on Facebook, Fantasy Rugby Draft. Or if you have any questions on the format, the way it works, drafting, or just want to have a chat, drop us a note at support@fantasyrugbydraft.com. Kucha, you're at Kuchartown, Kuchar Town.
Correct.
Nice one. Just for those having a look through the player hub as well at certain players that are missing, we're hoping that Opta will give us an update soon now that Super Rugby has finished, and there's also a few other players that are missing that need to be put in there, and even some that are on the wrong team. So there's a little bit of a shout out to Sam Roberts, actually, who's been helping us with updating a few of the players that we don't have in the right teams, or at least are missing as well. But that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for downloading and listening. I'm Bruce Wilkinson. He's Kuchartown.
I am a Michael Bolton fan.